Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh akhi. I hope you are well. I thought I'll record the answer inshallah ta'ala so that you can review it time and time again if you need to. Quick thing before we go into the answer, and it's as a gift inshallah ta'ala. You can make a comparison between learning and catching prey, in the sense that if a person catches prey, he goes through the effort of catching something that he was searching for. He will make sure to tie it well after he's gone through the effort so that it doesn't run away. Likewise, when you go through the effort of learning, asking a question, understanding it, then try your best to write it down so that you can preserve it bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. We'll look through this question inshallah ta'ala at an introductory level. And if you have any more questions, feel free to ask again bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So we'll look at the letter Ra first and then the letter Lam. The Shaykh Ibn al-Jazari put together in his introductory poem Al-Muqaddimah Fima Yajibu ala Qari al-Qur'ani an ya'lamah, the chapter of Ra, and he mentioned therein وَرَقِّقِ الرَّاءَ إِذَا مَا كُسِرَتْ كذاك بعد الكسر حيث سكنت إن لم تكن من قبل حرف استعلاء أو كانت الكسرة ليست أصلا والخلف في فرق لكسر يوجد وأخف تكريرا إذا تشدد. So he's saying here rahimahullah, and make the ra light إذا ما كسرت, if it has a kasra. كذاك, likewise make it light بعد الكسر حيث سكنت, after, if it has sukoon and it comes after a kasra, a letter that has kasra. So in these two situations, make it light. Then he goes on to say, as an exception, إن لم تكن من قبل حرف استعلاء, as long as it is not, i.e. when it has sukoon and the letter before it has a kasra, make it light, as long as it is not before, i.e. the ra is not before a letter of isti'la, and here it means that the back of the tongue is raised, and thus then you have the fruit of that is that the letter is heavy. So as long as the ra sukoon is not before a heavy letter, in that case don't make it light. So that's an exception. Then he gives you another exception to that scenario. أو كانت الكسرة ليست أصلا, or the kasra is not originally meant to be there, and i.e. when you have a kasra before a ra sukoon or ra sakina, and the kasra is on a hamzatul wasl, for example. Then he mentions another issue, وَالْخُلْفُ فِي فِرْقٍ, and there is a difference with regards to the word firq. Why is the difference? لِكَسْرٍ, because of the kasra. So firqin, and because you can either say firqin or firqin. Why? Because the ra has sukoon, before it is a kasra, and after it is a heavy letter, but this heavy letter has kasra on it. So some recited the ra heavy and some recited it light. And then in the end of that second half of that last line, he mentions some advice with regards to the characteristic of the letter ra. So if we were to divide what we've just read and add to it, notice that the author rahimahullah, he didn't mention when the ra is heavy in general to make it shorter for the reader. It's as though he's saying this is when the ra is going to be light, and as for the other times, then know that it's going to be heavy. So he didn't want to make the poem too long for the beginner. So let's just put it into some sort of kind of table or column form. If the ra has a harakah, then if the harakah is a kasra, it will be light. If the harakah is a fatha, it will be heavy. If the harakah is a dhamma, it will be heavy. Good. طيب. What about now the next scenario? The ra has sukoon. Then we look at the letter before it. If the letter before it has a dhamma, then the ra will be heavy. If the letter before it has a fatha, then the ra will be heavy. If the letter before it has a kasra, then the ra will be light. طيب. Next scenario. Next scenario is an exception. Okay, what if the ra has sukoon and the letter before it has a kasra? We said it will be light. Okay, but in this case, if after the ra sukoon sakina there's a letter which is a heavy letter, like in the word mirsad, then the ra will be heavy. The ra will be pronounced heavily. So this is another scenario now, that if the ra has sukoon and before it is a kasra, but after it there is a heavy letter, then the ra will be pronounced heavily. Okay. Another scenario, if the ra has sukoon and before it is a kasra which is not originally there, such as, for example, when the kasra is on a hamzatul wasl, and that comes, for example, at the end of Surah Al-Fajr, towards the end of Surah Al-Fajr, irji'i. The kasra there, the ra has sukoon, and the kasra before it is not originally there, so the ra will be pronounced heavily. And then the author mentioned the difference with regards to the word firqin. If you're going to pronounce the kasra on the qaf, then the ra can be pronounced heavy or light. Okay. Next set of scenarios, if the ra has sukoon and the letter before it also has a sukoon, then if the ra has sukoon, the letter before it has sukoon, then the letter before that has a dhamma, then the ra will be heavy. If the ra has sukoon, the letter before it has sukoon, and then the letter before that has a fatha, then the ra will be heavy. And there's an exception to this, we're going to discuss it in a second. If the ra has sukoon and the letter before it has sukoon and the letter before that has a kasra, then the ra will be light. And now this is the exception I mentioned we're going to discuss. If the ra has sukoon and the letter before it is a ya sukoon, a ya with a sukoon, then even if before that is a fatha, the ra will still be light. Okay, so if the ra has sukoon and the letter before it has sukoon, but that letter is a ya, then even if the letter before the ya has a fatha, the ra will still be pronounced lightly. Okay, so now if we look at the scenario, if we put it into columns on one sheet, we have a number of scenarios available to us that we've covered in these previous slides. Okay, if we want to put the numbers under each of these headings, then they are as follows. The number of times that the ra will be heavy are 8 scenarios or 8 situations. The number of times that the ra will be light are 4, and the number of times that there is a difference are 2. We only discussed 1. The other one is a bit more complicated. We can discuss it in class if you want to, but for now you don't need to worry about it. So your homework is as follows. On this, if you write this in your book and then look at the slides before, and under each heading put which scenarios fall under which heading. So under heavy, for example, underneath you're supposed to have 8 different scenarios. Put there if the ra has a fatha, if the ra has a dhamma, and so forth. Under light, put the 4 different scenarios where the ra will be light, and so on. And then for the previous slides that we mentioned, or for the scenarios that we mentioned, bring an example for each one from the Quran and just send it to me by message, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, with a side point here, an easy way to remember this is that the heavy situations, or the situations where the ra is heavy, are 8. The situations where the ra is light are half of that, 4. And the situations where there is a difference are half of that, 2. طيب. Next thing to look at was the lam. And the letter lam, before the author rahimahullah mentions this line, a couple of chapters before that he mentions to be careful not to make the lam heavy. He mentions be careful not to make the lam heavy, and then he brings us a number of words and sentences where a person should be careful not to make the lam heavy. And here he brings the scenario where the lam would be heavy. for most of us. For us at this level in our class, this is the only time that you'll see the lam heavy. And he mentions وَفَخِّمِ اللَّامَ مِنِ اسْمِ اللَّهِ عَنْ فَتْحٍ أَوْ ضَمٍّ كَعَبْدُ اللَّهِ. And make the lam heavy in the name of Allah, عن فتح, when it comes or with regards to the fatha or dhamma, like Abdullah, i.e. if before the name of Allah comes a word with a fatha or a dhamma right before the name of Allah, then you will make the lam in Allah's name heavy. This is what the author rahimahullah ta'ala is pointing to. So if before the name of Allah comes a fatha or a dhamma, then the lam in the name of Allah will be heavy. And the same can be said with when you read Allahumma. Okay? Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. If you have any questions, feel free to just message me. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.